Okay, so we're starting with the third book of the Torah. I like to do this just when we start each new book, just to think about the 5 books of Moses and the time frame, the timeline. We do this every time. We'll do it again. It's going to take 60 seconds. So if you look at the first book of the Torah and think about how much time it covers, what the time period is. So it's from the beginning of recorded history, the creation, all the way to Jacob going down to Egypt. So it's a little bit more than 2,000 years. So you have 2,000 years within one book. Then you go to the next book, the book of the Exodus. The book of Exodus pretty much covers a period of 200 and maybe 10 or 11 years from when Jacob and the Jewish people enter Egypt until the Exodus. And it also includes a full year after the Exodus, almost the first anniversary of the Exodus. So it's almost 211 years. So while book 1 is over 2,000 years, book 2 is 200 years, a little more than 200 years. Book 3 is interesting. Book 3 doesn't take any time. There's only one event in book 3 that happens at the inauguration of the temple on the 8th day, which we discussed last week. So it's just law. So this was the information conveyed to Moshe at the tent of meeting, but there's no time frame. So I would say, how long did it take? Maybe it covers one day, right? I don't know exactly when each commandment was conveyed, but the storyline is just one day. Then you go to the fourth book, and the fourth book covers the next almost 39 years. That's the book of the Jewish people journeying through the desert, 39 years, almost 39 years. And then the final book is the last 37 days of Moshe's life. So if you want, again, just quickly, the summary, the first book is over 2,000 years. The second book is 211 years, a little bit less than 211. Third book is maybe, the time period is maybe a day, maybe a week, I don't know. I guess a week. And then fourth book, 39 years. Fifth book, 37 days. So that's just putting us in the context of where we are. And again, where are we in the narrative? We in the end of the third book, the Jewish people built and constructed the temple. And the end of the last few verses of the book, as we discussed last week, the divine presence dwelled within the tent of meeting. And we're going to go back to that story in a few weeks in the Parsha called Shmini, the 8th, what the events that happened on that day, the death of Aaron's sons. So we're going to go back to that. But right now we're talking about the commandments. So we have the ark, we have the temple. What do we do in the temple? Oh, you bring offerings. Okay, so now we have the book of the offerings. So that's just where we are in the book. So we'll share the nutshell. Parsha in a nutshell, the summary. Here we go. God calls to Moses from the tent of meeting and communicates to him the laws of the korbanot, the offerings, the animal and meal offerings brought in the sanctuary. These include, and I'm sorry for all the lists, but there's lists of different various forms of offerings. So the ascending offering, literally in Hebrew it's olah, which means to ascend, to go up, that is wholly raised to God by the fire atop the altar. So if you're going to bring we call it an ascending offering, elevation offering, whatever you call it, all of it is offered to God on the fire, slaughtered, and then it's all offered to the fire. And then you have 5 varieties of meal offering, mincha, prepared with fine flour, olive oil, and frankincense. Then you have the peace offering, shlamim, comes from the word shalom, peace, whose meat was eaten by the one bringing the offering, after parts are burned on the altar and parts are given to the Kohanim priests. It's almost like a joke. The Talmud says, it's not a joke, it's serious, but we'll see later the significance of this. But the Talmud says, why is it called a peace offering? Because you make everybody happy. God gets a portion, meaning the altar gets a portion, the priests get a portion, priests get what to eat, and the person bringing the offering also gets a piece of steak. So you make everybody happy. If you make everybody happy, it's peace. You know the famous story. Okay, I don't have to say it, but I'll say it anyway. The famous story is that the 2 litigants come to the rabbi and they say, we have a dispute. So the rabbi listens to the plaintiff and he says, you're right. Then the rabbi listens to the defendant and says, you're right. Then the Rebbitzin says, they both can't be right. He says, you know what? You're also right. So everybody's happy. So the peace offering, everybody's happy. So that's the peace offering. Then we have different types of sin offerings, chatat, brought to atone for transgressions committed erroneously by the high priest, the entire community, the king, or the ordinary Jew. So it's a class of karbanot chatat, sin offering. It's interesting that we don't start with the ordinary Jew, we start with the leaders, right? The leader has to repent. If the leader could take responsibility, then the ordinary Jew will also take responsibility. So when the sin offerings are introduced, we begin with the high priest, the community. The community is really the court. In other words, if the court makes an error and gives a false ruling, and everybody follows the court, then the court has to bring the sin offering, the king or the ordinary Jew. But it's funny, the ordinary Jew is placed in the last one. Okay, fine. Then we have the guilt offering, asham, brought by one who has misappropriated property of the sanctuary, who is in doubt as whether he transgressed the divine prohibition, or who has committed a betrayal against God by swearing falsely to defraud a fellow man. So there's a list of, I think it's 5 sins that a person would bring, not the classic sin offering, but an asham, which is called a guilt offering. Okay, so that's the story in a nutshell. Very technical. The Torah goes into great detail about the various forms of offerings, and the Torah talks about what the procedure of offering these offerings are, and it gets very technical and very detailed. It's considered one of the most technical portions in the Torah. So that's for Vayikra. That's the nutshell. Now we want to talk about what is really happening here and how is it relevant to us, because we don't have animal sacrifices today. We also can talk about what's the significance and what's the purpose of animal sacrifice historically. So there's a lot to get into, and a lot of introductions necessary. The problem is some of the introductions we said in the past years, some introductions do not have to be repeated. Some introductions have to be repeated. So we'll see where we go. I'm just thinking where to begin. So I'm going to try to do this in a coherent way. You have the 2 books, you have the 5 books of the Torah. Let's try to think about this. What's the plots? Where are we going? Where are we headed? Okay. So one way to think about this is the Torah actually doesn't have 5 books, it really has 4 books. So let's eliminate the 5th book. What's the 5th book? The 5th book is repetition. Mishnah Torah. It's Moses' repetition. Okay, that's out of the way. Now, what's happening here? So what's the pattern of the 4 books? So one way to think about it is that in some sense, and I'm going to talk about this later as well today, in some sense, history has been completed. We create the world. God creates the world in Genesis. That's really the theme of the book of Genesis, creation. And then there's a family that discovers God. So that's Abraham and his family. So we have creation and the recognition of creation. Wonderful. That's Genesis. And then you come to Exodus. What's Exodus? Exodus is we get the Torah. And what do? We build a house for God. And God dwells amongst the Jewish people. Okay, Mazel Tov, we're done. In other words, the story is over. We're done. We achieved what has to be achieved. In some sense, that's a certain wholesomeness, a wholesome story. Where do we go from here? So now there's 2 places to go. In other words, everything is done. If I finish the Torah, if I told you there's no 5 books of Moses, there's only 2 books of Moses. Okay, wonderful. God created the world. There was a family that discovered God. God gives us the Torah. God tells us to make a home for God. God dwells in the home. Mazel tov. Let's go home. Let's go home and party. Let's make Kiddush. We're done. So what happens now? So now the question is, what's the result of God dwelling within the Jewish people? So the answer is there's 2 results. There's 2 things. There's 2 responses. One is within the person. If God is present within the world, if God is present within this temple, so then we want to draw close to God. In other words, if God is accessible, then the response is, I want to draw close to God. That's one response. The other response is, if God is in the world, if God is accessible and God is coming within society, so we want to now take the holiness and influence the rest of the world as well. Not enough that God dwells amongst the Jewish people. We want to influence the entire world. In other words, Judaism's message is twofold. It's a personal message of, I want to become close to God. And then it's the collective universal message is if God is accessible to people, so let's spread the light to the rest of the world and transform the entire world. Right? You following? So there's God dwells amongst the Jewish people. We're done. What now? Now there's a personal response. I want to come close to God. And then there's the collective response, universal response. Let's spread the light to the rest of the world. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because in some sense, book 3 and book 4 are really these two separate and distinct responses. Book 3 is if God dwells amongst the Jewish people, if God is accessible, so I want to become close to God. So what's the theme of book 3? How does the human being, how does the person become close to God? And then we have you bring the offerings, then you have to be pure and impure, or laws of purity and impurity, and then laws of the sacrifice, holidays and special times and special occasions. This is all, but if you want to generalize, it's all a book in response to last week, in response to the end of Exodus, where God dwells amongst the Jewish people. Okay, so now what do? Now I want to become close. Okay, this is a book of how to become close to God. That's book 3. What's book 4? Book 4 is the book of Numbers, but it's the book of traveling through the desert, of getting us to the land of Israel. Getting in the land of Israel means building a society that ultimately will become a light unto the nations. So book 4 is the trials and tribulations of trying to go and spread and journey and influence the rest of the world. So you see what I'm saying? I'm saying after book 2 now continues on 2 different tracks. There's the personal track, which is book 3, and there's the collective universal track, the journey toward Israel, which is ultimately the journey toward creating a society that will ultimately influence the world, and that is in book 4. And that's why if you look at the Torah, the narrative that concludes in verse and in this end of the second book continues in 2 places. It continues in book 3 and it continues in book 4. So I alluded to earlier already, I said that the 8th day, the day that the inauguration of a temple happened, which we read about in the end of book 2, is repeated in book 3. And that same day, what happened on that 8th day, the 1st of Nisan, as we discussed last week, the inauguration of a temple, that is also elaborated upon in book 4. So what's happening here? Book 2 continues in 2 places. It continues in book 3 and in book 4. Why is that? Because book 2 means God is accessible in this world. Now the question is, what does that mean? What's the response? We have 2 responses. We have the personal response and then the universal response. And in book 3, we're going to talk about primarily the personal response. If you want to talk about the universal message, okay, that's in book 4. So this is just to give sort of an overview of what's happening here and where the story is developing. Okay, now we can get into the specifics, and we'll share the text.
Rabbi, can I ask you a quick question about your introduction?
Yes.
In book 3, are we talking about only personal or interpersonal within Jewish people?
So in book 3, it's like what I said is very general. So it's also interpersonal, and it's also how to create a society. But because in the book, you also have laws about, like, for example, the mitzvah to love your fellow as yourself is in the 3rd book. And there are many mitzvot of charity and many mitzvot of how to set up a just society. So what I'm saying is very general. I'm saying, generally speaking, if we want to come close to God, then we should live this way. What does this way mean? Come close to God, treat your neighbor with respect, live the values, create a healthy society. But that's all the means of bringing myself close to God. Right? That's all under that umbrella. Then, in other words, it's almost the same law could be done for 2 reasons, right? Loving your fellow as yourself could be as a way of bringing yourself closer to God or as perfecting the world, right? They're both true. It just depends on what the spiritual purpose is. And there, like I said, there's 2 legitimate results. There's really 2 responses to the realization of a human being that God is accessible. One is I come close to God. Two is I influence the rest of the world. And in some sense, that's the two books. Now, like I said, each one includes both. Of course, if you can influence the world, you also have to be close to God yourself. And of course, if you're close to God yourself, you also have to be a mensch and live with other people and have be morally upright with other people, right? So each one includes the other one. But the question is, what's the overarching theme?
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So let's share the screen and let's jump into the first verse. The first verse of the book of Leviticus is a wonderful verse. I love it. Part of the reason why I love it is because there's a lot of problems with the verse, and problems means opportunities, so that's good. Okay, so traditionally we refer to this book as, not traditionally, the English name is Leviticus, and that's because it's the book with many laws of the sacrifices which were offered by the Levites, by the priests, which was a family within the Levites. That name is not the common way the Jewish people refer to the third book, but even though that name does have a source within Judaism, because the rabbinic way of referring to the third book is Torah Kohanim, the laws of the priests. Okay, so Leviticus is sort of similar to that name, the laws of the priests. We refer to it as Vayikra. Vayikra is the first word of the book. If you look in the Hebrew, Vayikra, which is and he called. The root is kara, called. There's a calling. Vayikra el Moshe. He called to Moshe. And the Lord spoke to him from the tent of meeting, saying. So the God calls Moshe from the tent of meeting, and then he tells him the laws of the offerings. And he tells them again, Daber Bnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man from among you brings a sacrifice to the Lord from animals, from cattle, or from the flock, they shall bring your sacrifice, etc., etc. Okay, fine. So we have all the laws. Why does it say, and he called to Moses? It's a very bad way. You don't start a book this way. You need a subject. And first of all, you don't start with a book with and. And means it's a continuation. Continuation to what? And he called Moshe. Who's the speaker? We don't know that till the second clause. And the Lord spoke to him. So the commentaries explain this verse, the first clause of the verse is designed to connect it to the previous book, right? What was the end of the book? The end of the book said that the glory of God filled the tent. The cloud filled the tent. Moshe could not enter the tent of meeting because of the cloud. That's how the book ends. And then it says about the journey. We're not going to get into that. But the end is Moshe can't come in. God dwells in the tabernacle. It's full of the cloud. You can't go into the cloud. So this book continues, Vayikra Moshe, but he calls to Moshe. And what does he say? He says, Adam ki akriv, a man wants to become close. So that's why I'm saying it's connected to the previous Parsha. Previous Parsha is God is here. What? So God is here. So what? So should I run away? God is awesome. No, there is a path to come close. God calls Moshe, and he speaks to him from the tent of meeting. So we're going to get to the problems with verse 8, with verse 1 in a minute. I want to talk about verse 2 for a second. Speak to the children of Israel and say to them. Okay, you lose it in the English. In English, they translate when a man from among you. Let's look at the Hebrew. Daber Bnei Yisrael, speak to the children of Israel. V'amarta alehem, and say to them, Adam. When I say Adam, what do you think of? You think of you think of Adam, the first human being. Because in the Torah, there are many ways to say man. There's 4 ways to say man. The most common one is ish. But here, the Torah says Adam, man. But it uses the word man, which also is the name of Adam, the first man. And the commentaries point out, Kabbalistic commentaries point out, that if you search the entire first 2 books of the Torah, from when Adam sinned and was expelled from the Garden of Eden, you will not find the word Adam. Adam is off the books. He's deleted from the books. Why? He sinned. We're not going to sit and talk about him. So the first 3 chapters of Genesis mention Adam plenty of times. Even Genesis, it does mention his name once in chapter 5, which is just to give you the chronology. After that, it doesn't say the word Adam, not referring to Adam, but the human being is not referred to as Adam, as we see in this week's Parsha. So now we're almost 2 books after we have not heard the word Adam, And God comes to Moshe and says, speak to the children of Israel, Adam, man, who wants to become close to God, Kiyakriv, wants to offer, this is how you should do it. So this is telling what exactly happens here. Why does Adam reemerge and reappear? So what do the Kabbalists say? The Kabbalists say something beautiful. They say the temple that we just finished building is the correction of Adam. Adam, who sinned, is now being corrected when the Jewish people build the temple. What do we mean? Adam sinned and was expelled from the Garden of Eden. What's the Garden of Eden? The Garden of Eden is a place which has both physical tranquility, but it's also a place where a person is connected to God and feels the presence of God. And when Adam was expelled from the Garden of Eden, he's broken. Now it takes almost 2,000 years, 2,400 years, and the Jewish people recreate the Garden of Eden. They recreate a space where the divine presence is in this world and where man could become close to God. Okay, that's the Garden of Eden. Okay, so there's not fruit there. You come and it looks a little bit different. But the atmosphere of the temple is the same atmosphere of the Garden of Eden. Now, we spoke about this when we spoke about the Garden of Eden. Once we're expelled from the Garden of Eden, the purpose is to recreate the Garden of Eden in the whole world. That the whole world should be a place of peace and tranquility and connection to God. Okay, so we couldn't, at that point, we didn't finish it. It was still not, the whole world is not Eden yet. But at this point in the story, we managed to create a stronghold. We managed to create a space where on this physical earth, God dwells and man can come close to God. That is the Garden of Eden. Now we just have to expand it, but it has already been created. Say the Kabbalists, of course, now we reintroduce Adam because now Adam is corrected. Now Adam, who destroyed that opportunity to live in this world and connect to God, now it's been corrected, and therefore we can touch that we can call the human being by Adam because we want to say Adam has been rectified by the collective Jewish people. So I thought that was a very interesting interpretation, because it doesn't only tell you why we use the word Adam, but what it tells you is that we reached a stage in the correction of the world by building the temple, by creating a home for God in this physical space. And that's why we speak about the word Adam, because we want to recreate that notion.
Who brings that down?
So I'll tell you the Kabbalist who says it. His name was the book is called Tzror Hamor. Tzror Hamor is the book. He was one of the students of the Arizal. So he lived in the 16th century in Sfat, in Safed. I forgot his first name. His last name was Seba, Samach Bezayin. I think Yaakov Seba. I think that was his name. But he's the student of the Arizal. But the reason why I hesitated to say that he's the source, because it's an earlier source. But you see here, the reason it's not really, I wasn't going to mention it because it's just a detail. But I'm going to mention it because you brought it up, and also because this teaches you how to read the Medrash. Okay, so we're going on a detour. Bear with me for a minute or two. I know you came here to figure out how the offerings are relevant in your life, and we'll get to that in a minute. But before that, I want to demonstrate how you're supposed to read a piece of Talmud and a piece of Rashi, and how the Rashi and the Medrash, there's hidden Kabbalah hidden inside. And if you read it the first time, you would never see it. But once you see what the Kabbalists say, Rashi makes sense as well. So here we're going to go. We're going to take a little short demonstration about how to study the Medrash and Rashi. Okay, let's find it. Okay, this, by the way, what I'm about to say is my own theory. I don't know that this is the source, but once you hear what that Kabbalist said, you hear what Rashi's saying. It's like too hard to ignore. Okay, so here we go. Here is the verse and here's the Rashi, right? Speak to the children of Israel and say to them, when a man from among you brings a sacrifice. So Rashi is also addressing the idea, we're using the word Adam. The word Adam. Why the word Adam? Why not Ish? Adam is one of the ways of saying man, but it has not been mentioned in almost 2 full books of the Torah. So let's see Rashi. Says Rashi, Hebrew, Adam. Why is this term used here as opposed to Ish? Says Rashi, it alludes to Adam, the first man on earth, and teaches us, just as Adam, the first man, never offered sacrifices from stolen property. Why not? because Adam can't offer sacrifices from stolen property. How do I know? Because everything belonged to him. He's the only man around. So he owns everything. So Adam didn't steal to offer a sacrifice. Since everything was his, so too you must not offer sacrifices from the stolen property. This is Vayikra Rabbah. This is from the Medrash. So the Medrash is teaching you law. So if you're a lawyer and you see the word Adam and you say, Adam, this reminds me of Adam. So what's the connection between the sacrifices and Adam? So the legalist has to derive a legal matter. So what's the legal connection? What's the legal conclusion? Just like Adam did not offer an offering from that is stolen, so to a human being, if you want to bring an offering to God, no problem. Take it from your bank account. You can't steal someone else's sheep and offer that to God. So it's a wonderful interpretation. It's very good. The lawyers are happy. But it's strange because there's just say, bring your own property. Why do you have to go around about and mention Adam? So once you see what the Kabbalists are doing, to me, it's obvious. When we say Adam, we're talking about Adam. We're talking about the rectified Adam. So because we're talking about rectified Adam, now we understand that we could therefore learn our offerings from Adam's offerings because the connection has been made. So you could either look at the connection from a legal perspective, which is just like Adam did not bring offerings that were stolen. So too, if you're going to bring an offering to God, make sure it's not stolen goods. But the Kabbalists say, yeah, that's a technical aspect. That's just the one aspect of the relationship. The deeper relationship is, ladies and gentlemen, Adam has been restored. Ladies and gentlemen, we have the Garden of Eden. The Garden of Eden is the home for God, is the temple. Now the question is, how do we enter the temple? How do we expand? How do we enter the Garden of Eden? How do we expand the Garden of Eden to the rest of the world? Well, ladies and gentlemen, that's the theme of book 3 and book 4, as we mentioned. But now you need the word Adam. Now you know the word Adam. A lot more to say about this. I'm going to do a few more minutes on this, but first go ahead, Vicky.
I just had a quick question. I thought that Adam's son offered the sacrifice. Adam didn't offer sacrifice.
Yes, so you're right. When you read the actual text of the Torah, it doesn't say that Adam offered a sacrifice. The first person that says that offered a mincha. By the way, it was a mincha. It was the same word used here as for the meal offering, but we'll get to that later, maybe if we have time. But you're right, it doesn't say that. But according to the Medrash, Adam does offer. Now, if you don't want to accept the Medrash, you could say whether he did, whether he didn't is irrelevant. If Adam would bring an offering, it wouldn't be stolen because everything belongs to him.
Thank you.
Okay, let's talk about, I'm staying on the same theme because I don't think we elaborated upon this in past years. So I'm just going to stay in there for another minute or two. So unfortunately, you can't see it here in the Hebrew. English. Oh, I know where I could show it to you. No, I can't show it to you there either. Okay, I can't show it to you here, so we'll just do it over here. Vayikra, and he called. In Hebrew, Vayikra. In the Torah scroll, the tradition is that the tradition passed down to Moses. Go ahead, Barry.
Rabbi, what about the notion that in Adam's time, everything was actually, I don't want to say owned, but maybe everything was Hashem's, was God's. Why does Adam even have a right to anything? Okay,
so you're getting into theories of ownership. Now, I hesitated to do that before because I don't remember exactly what the Rebbe has a discourse on this, on the subtlety of Rashi, where Rashi explains that Adam owns everything. And so the bottom line is, I don't remember offhand the discussion, but there definitely is a discussion on this. What is the meaning of ownership? Is the fact that nobody else is around means I own it, or does it mean that I actually have to take possession? So I don't remember offhand, But you're right. It is a discussion. It is a discussion of what does it mean that everything belonged to Adam, and why did everything belong to Adam? I would say, yeah, I would make something up, but I know that there's a real answer, and I don't remember it. So why would I make something up if there's a real answer that I don't remember?
If you want to give a sacrifice, you think that you should be entitled and have ownership and have and it's yours and giving it up. But what's to say it's yours? That was a little
ownership. What's the philosophical idea of ownership? That's I mean, the scholars in the West are thinking about this since the 17th century, and we're probably thinking about it a little bit earlier than that. But that's a good discussion. But what the one thing you just mentioned, which got me thinking, which brings up this point that God gives us ownership. Why does God give us ownership? Because if we don't have ownership, then we can't give, right? If you create a society where nobody owns anything, everything is collective, then there's no kindness and there's no offering, because I'm not giving something that belongs to me because it doesn't really belong to me, because it belongs to the collective.
Interesting.
God, right? So the premise of kindness in general and the premise of offering, Rashi says, insists, it's yours. Why is it yours? It's God's. Yeah, but God found the mechanism to give it to you depending on how you think about ownership. But there's a mechanism where God says, you can take ownership, you can have it. And that's critical, not just for capitalism, for people should be encouraged to create, etc., but it's also critical for spirituality, because if it's not yours, then you're not giving. And if it's not yours, you're not kind. And then if you're not kind and you're not giving, then you're not godly, because God is giving. And if I'm just a recipient and I'm not a giver, then I'm not godly. So that's a discussion. That's another discussion. Okay, let's look back at the Adam connection. I'm sorry I'm staying so long on this, but I'm just going to finish this point and we move on. Vayikra, and he called. If you open the Torah scroll, you will see that this is a small aleph. This aleph in this text, it's large. In the Torah scroll, it's small. And because we have a tradition passed down from Moses, how to write the letters. Most letters in the Torah are obviously average sized. There are a few letters that are either small or extra large. And you have to keep that tradition, because if I write a Torah scroll and I write Vayikra with an aleph, and the aleph has a small, and the aleph is not small, then it's not kosher. Or if when you're supposed to have a large aleph and it's not large, it's not kosher. It has to be precise. So Vayikra al Moshe, he called to Moshe small aleph. Why a small aleph? So there's a medrash. The commentary explains. God calls to Moshe. Why does God call Moshe? Because Moshe is humble. The small aleph represents humility. Because Moshe is humble, that's why God speaks to him. We know that the Torah says that about Moses. We know two things about Moses. We don't know if he was charismatic. We don't know if he was good looking. We know he couldn't speak. But what do we know about Moses? What were his credentials? So we know that Moshe was the greatest prophet. The Torah says so. God says so. But we also know he was the humblest of man. So Moshe was humble. And because he was humble, that's why God speaks to him. What's the lesson? If you want God to speak to you, you have to be humble. In other words, when you're humble, you can truly get the objective truth. Okay, fine. But the Medrash goes on. The Medrash goes on and says that there is another place in the Torah where there's a large aleph, and that's the first page, the first word of the book of Divrei Hayamim, of Chronicles. And there it talks about the history of man, and it starts with Adam. And there Adam has a large aleph. So Moshe is a small aleph, Adam is a large aleph. So what does that mean? So the commentaries explain, Moshe is humble, that's why God calls him. Adam is arrogant, he has a large aleph. You see, aleph could mean, that was the first letter of Adam, it could be man. Aleph could be I, ani is I. So Moshe has a small I. Adam has a big aleph. Adam is arrogant. And because Adam is arrogant, therefore Adam fails and sins, right? If you look back at the sin of the tree of knowledge, how does the serpent convince Adam and Eve to partake of fruit of the tree of knowledge? He says, you'll eat and you'll be like God. You'll know good from evil. You'll be like God. So Adam says, oh, you'll be like God? Not a bad job. I want to be like God. I'll do it. Okay. So he has this arrogance where he says, I want to be like God. Moshe is humble. So Adam fails. And Moshe, because of his humility, he succeeds in having the relationship with God. That's what the Medrash says. What does the Hasidic commentary do with this Medrash? We're not here to bash Adam. To the contrary, what we're trying to do here is we're saying that Moshe corrects Adam. Again, same theme. Just like the Jewish people recreate the Garden of Eden with the temple, Moshe now corrects Adam and expresses the humility that Adam has. Now, but what about Adam's quote-unquote arrogance? So the way the Hasidic interpretation explains it is beautiful. A person has to have both humility and arrogance, not arrogance in the negative word, but to feel his own esteem and to understand his own qualities. You have to be humble, but you have to be proud. And it seems like a contradiction, but it's not a contradiction. You need both. And Adam's mistake was that he didn't know when to employ which feeling. The Hasidim always said that, not Chabad, but there's other Hasidic traditions, is that a person, there's two different statements in the Talmud that say opposite things. And the Hasidim would say a person has to have two pieces of paper in their pocket at all times. That's each one says something else. So one paper says, Bishvili nivra ha'olam, the world was created for me. Okay, oh, I'm a great guy. Of all the 7 billion people, God created the world just for me. The world was created just for me. And the other one was, oh, you see, I'm not humble. I forgot the other one. The other one is, I forgot already. I'm nothing. I'm dust and earth. I forgot already. I forgot which verse, but another verse that says that I'm nothing. Which one? So what is my esteem? Am I great? Is the whole world created for me? Am I the center of the universe, or am I nothing? Answer both. You have to have both in your pocket. What does it mean? So it means as follows. Vayikra Moshe. When God calls Moshe, when you're standing before God in an attentive meeting, you have to be humble. But in the book of Chronicles, what's Chronicles? The Chronicles of the world, the story of the world, how you should go out and influence the world. There you can have humility, because with humility, you're never going to be able to influence the world. You have to have pride. You have to understand your qualities. You have to understand the God-given gifts that you have to be able to influence and withstand the pressure of the world. So now it all fits. In the book of Leviticus, where it says, "Vayikra Moshe," God calls to Moshe. Of course, if God will call you, you're humble before God. But in the book of Chronicles, you're going out to the world. There you need a big aleph. There you need to understand your esteem and understand that you are empowered by God to change the world. And in some sense, you are the most important person in the world in the context of fulfilling your own mission. So it's not, when you read the Medrash superficially, it seems like we're saying Moses good, Adam bad. No, Moses is correcting Adam. Moses is telling us when to express the humility and when to express the confidence and pride. And both are necessary. Before God, I am humble. Before the challenges of the world, I am confident and proud. So that's, again, all this is on the same theme. We spent 42 minutes on this theme, that what's happening in this book, it's dramatic. Make no mistake, this is not a book about a technicality. When I bring the offering to God, where should I put the blood? On this part of the altar, that part of the altar? That's that as well. But it's much more than that. What's really happening here is, once again, the human being faces God in the Garden of Eden. God is in this world. Now the question is, how do I approach God in the appropriate way once he is in this world? So that all is by way of introduction, the first 42 minutes. Now we could start the class, and we could start talking about offerings. Okay, the reason why there's so many introductions are necessary, I'm going to skip all the introductions, but just to introduce the introductions, is because a lot of people have trouble relating. Modern people have trouble relating to this book because we don't do animal sacrifices anymore, and it makes us uncomfortable. But we should understand that even when animal sacrifices were performed, the purpose was never the actual ritual. The purpose is the emotion that it evokes within the person. And today, when we don't have the animal sacrifice, it's just about the emotion and just about the feeling. But even when we had the feeling, even when we had the actual sacrifice, the most important thing was the emotion. Now, it happens to be that we all know in Judaism, the most important thing is the action, not the emotion, right? If I'm going to give charity, even if I'm doing it for a selfish reason, it doesn't matter. The most important thing is action in Judaism. Hamasa hu eikar, action is supreme. There's only one exception. The exception is the offerings. In the offerings, there are pages and pages in the Mishnah. What happens if I bring an elevation offering But while I brought the elevation offering, the priest's intention was that was a peace offering. Oh, it's disqualified. Okay, so the only ritual that is disqualified because of thought is the offerings. Why? Because the whole purpose of the offering is not the ritual. It is the emotion that and the feeling that it evokes within the person. So this is the exception. This is why the book of offerings is different than every other ritual of the Torah. Therefore, this explains why Isaiah, when the Jewish people were sinning in the period of the first temple, they were totally immoral, but yet they were offering the offerings and fulfilling all the ritual. Isaiah says, I have no idea why you're bringing offerings. I don't need your offerings. And then the prophet, I'm not sure if it's Isaiah or another prophet, says, you know something? Is I never really commanded you to bring offerings. So why are you bringing offerings? Which is a very strange statement, because last I checked, there's a full book of the Torah, Leviticus, which is dedicated primarily to offerings. So what does it mean that God says, I never commanded you to offer offerings? The answer is that offerings is here to evoke an emotion. And what God is saying, if it's not evoking that emotion, if it's not making you a better person, I never asked you to bring these offerings. So if you light Hanukkah candles, or you put on tefillin, or you eat in the sukkah, and you don't have the proper intention, okay, so you don't have the intention, you don't have the meditation, but you have the mitzvah. The offerings, if you bring an offering and it's mindless, it's not an offering, because it's not a mitzvah, because there's a sacrifice, you're taking away an animal life. And to do that, there must be a reason, there must be a justification. And the justification must be the change that it brings about within the human being. So what I'm saying is, even when we had offerings, the main thing was the emotion. Now, when we don't have the offerings, certainly the main thing is with the emotion. So let's talk about the emotion, and let's talk about the state of mind of the person bringing these offerings and what they evoke within us. And therefore, that's how it becomes relevant to us. Now, I just want to say, generally speaking, the sages say that now we don't have offerings, but we have the prayers that substitute for offerings. And therefore, just like there were daily offerings, we have daily prayers. And just like there's voluntary offerings, there could be voluntary prayers. I don't want to get too technical. The same thing is with prayer. Just like I said before, that offerings without intention is not a mitzvah. Prayer without intention is not a mitzvah. If I walk in and I say the words and I'm thinking about the stock market, I'm not thinking that I'm talking to God, it's not a mitzvah. It's not a mitzvah. Every other mitzvah, doesn't matter what you think. Eat the matzah. I don't care if you're thinking about whatever you want to think about. It doesn't matter. Just eat the matzah, right? Why? Because the main thing is the action. Here, it's no action at all, because the prayer is here to express the idea of the offerings, and the offering is here to evoke a certain feeling within the person. Okay. I want to go into the body and talk about the different forms of sacrifices and what they mean to us. And even though you can divide this parsha into 5 categories of offerings, that's what the nutshell did. But we're going to go a little bit more general, and we're going to divide the parsha into 3 categories of offerings. And they are the olah, the elevation offering. It's all given to God. And the reason why the parsha in a nutshell says it's 5, because within the elevation offering, there could be an animal, there could be a bird. In other words, there could be a mammal, there could be, in other words, cattle, or a bird, or grain. But we're going to put them all in the same category. It's all olah, it's all elevation offering, it's all brought close to God. Okay. It's all offered to God entirely. Then, after that, we have the shlamim, the peace offering, which we mentioned. There's different forms of peace offerings. Next week, the Torah elaborates about the peace offering. There's a Thanksgiving offering, there's a type of peace offering, all kinds of peace offerings. But what all peace offerings have in common is it's not all given to God. It's not absolute sacrifice and devotion. I'll give some to God, some I keep for myself, some I'll give to the priest. And then finally, when you get to the third category, is the sin offering. And then I'm saying it's the third category, even though the Torah has 2 different categories. There's the sin offering and the guilt offering, but we're going to put it all in the same bucket. So we have 3 buckets. We have elevation offering, totally given to God. We have peace offering, partially given to God, partially given to myself, partially given to the priest. At least I didn't sin. And finally, the third one is if I sin, I have to bring an offering to God. Now, what's the conventional way of reading these verses? So let's start from the beginning. Why does a person bring an elevation offering? The answer is there's no reason. He doesn't have to. He wants to. He wants to feel close to God. Rashi makes that point right away. Adam ki yakriv, man that will offer. Rashi says, why does man offer? Because a person is spiritually motivated. I want to come close to God. At some point in our life, we have a spiritual awakening. We want to come close to God. What do? I bring an offering. You don't have to. There's no reason to, just because you want to become close. That's the olah. If you want to become close, you give the offering entirely to God. Now, when you look at this parsha from the conventional lens, it looks like it's going from the highest level of holiness, and then it descends. In other words, the beginning is the most commendable. Somebody wants to give a gift to God, and he's willing to give the gift to God completely. Beautiful. Second offering, he only wants to give half. All right, you go to the store, you buy something for your wife, you buy a piece of cake or whatever she likes, and say, yeah, but I'm taking half. It doesn't work. It's impressive. It's better than not buying her anything. But if you're only giving half, okay, so that doesn't express that devotion. But in the first offering, wow, I'm giving you everything. I bought a gift and it's entirely for you. Amazing. So the first, what it seems is the first level, we're talking about somebody who's totally motivated to become close to God and therefore is giving a gift entirely. Wonderful. What's the second one? Second one, okay, I want to eat dinner. I'll give some to God, some to the priest, some to me. Everybody's happy. Peace offering. Everybody's happy. And then you get to the end of the parsha. The end of the parsha is really unfortunate because it talks about all the sins. We're human. We're going to sin. So now we have a path to correct the sin, and that's bringing either a sin offering or a guilt offering, depending on the sin, depending on what type of sin it is. Okay, that's the end. That has to be on the list. But obviously, that's the lower level. If you had a choice to be the person who's bringing the olah, the elevation offering, or the person bringing the sin offering, of course, you want to bring the elevation offering. That's the conventional interpretation. We go from top to bottom. We're going down. We're going downhill. Problem is that the Hasidim don't want to go downhill. Everything has to be an advancement. We don't go backwards. We go forward. So we have no choice but to flip everything on its head. So that's what we're going to do. And we're going to say the olah, the fact that a person wants to come close to God and give a gift entirely to God is a wonderful thing. But that's only step one. Beyond that, you have to grow. So now what we're going to do is we're going to show how we do this, how we flip everything on the head and show that we're moving from the lower level to the higher level. Okay, so a person wants to become spiritually elevated. What does he want to do? He wants to give himself over entirely to God. When you have a spiritual awakening, you say, I don't want to have anything to do with the world. I'm going to shut off my TV. If people still do TV, shut off my phone, shut off my Instagram. I want to separate. I want to get away from all the distractions, and I want to devote myself entirely to God. That's the olah. That's the elevation. I want to completely give myself over. And that's a wonderful thing. But that's not the goal, and that's not the ultimate. It's only the first step. Because according to Judaism, the purpose is not to escape the world. The purpose is to sanctify the world. And that's why we have a very strange offering. Now, I didn't go and investigate all the ancient religions, but at least some people say that the second offering, the category of peace offering, is uniquely Jewish. Almost no other religion has a festival where I eat, and that's considered an offering to God, right? So the peace offering is making peace between the spiritual and the physical. That, ladies and gentlemen, is an advancement. It's much harder to make peace between physical and spiritual than to just escape the physical. Becoming an elevation offering, saying, I just want to become close to God and I'm going to forget about all the worldly matters, is a wonderful thing. It's the first step. You'll see in a minute. The Kabbalah says you have to run and then return. So you need to have this feeling of, we're talking about God, you recognize that God is in the Garden of Eden. God is in the world. We can come close to God. So what emotion does that evoke? That evokes an emotion to run to God. And every morning we try to cultivate that emotion. We cover our eyes. We say the rest of the world is irrelevant. What's relevant is the Lord is our God. The Lord is one. And then we say, love the Lord your God. So we're creating this feeling. We're recreating this feeling of the person who wants to bring an elevation offering. Elevation offering is just a symbol. I want to elevate myself. I want to come close to spirituality. And that's a wonderful thing. It's the first step. But if I stop there, I missed the boat. I missed the point. Because the purpose is, okay, now you're inspired to come close to God. Now you became close to God. Now see if you can have that feeling, not just when you pray, but also when you eat breakfast. See if you could bring a peace offering. Peace offering would mean that some of this experience goes to God. Some of this experience you eat, you consume but you're doing it in a holy way, in a holy environment for a holy purpose. That is much harder to make peace between heaven and earth than to run to heaven. Running to heaven is relatively easy. So that's how we go from step 1 to step 2. Now, how do you get to what's step 3? Step 3 is a sin offering. Sounds like the worst. It sounds like the worst in some sense, but if you want to talk about the depth of the relationship to God, the person who has a deeper relationship with God is the person who sinned, where the relationship was tested, and yet the person now is motivated to recreate the bond, to reconcile with God, to say there was a separation, but that separation is so painful, and therefore the separation itself motivates me to come close once again. That person actually has a deeper feeling of connection to God, because he realizes that the bond between God and the human being is unconditional. And therefore, no matter what we do, no matter what we sin, God gives us a path to return because we're unconditional, because the love is unconditional. Right? You have some people that, for example, just giving an example of relationships between children and parents. And some children, they always listen to their parents. Why? Because they were the best child ever. Why? So you would think it's a good thing, but psychologists say it's very bad because they're afraid that if they don't listen to their parents, then their parents won't love them anymore. So everything they're doing for decades, they're pleasing their parents because they don't realize, they're afraid, if I consciously or subconsciously, that if I don't listen to my parents, then they're going to abandon me. It doesn't have to be abandon me physically, but emotionally. And that's unhealthy because that's not a healthy relationship. The deeper relationship would be when I realize, you know something? I did not do what my parents wanted. There was pain, there was separation, but now there could be reconciliation. Why? Because that bond that I thought is conditional, now I discover is unconditional. No matter what I do, my parents will always accept me again. No matter what I do, God is always waiting for me to come back. So in that sense, talking about intensification of the bond to God, ironically, the sin offering leads us to a higher level because that leads us to the recognition that the bond with God is unconditional. So now we switched it. The first step, very nice. You want to come close to God. That's very nice. That's the elevation offering. It's a good first step. You come to shul in the morning, you pray. Either you come to shul, you don't come to shul, but you pray, you cover your eyes, you say Shema, you say Modani. You have a spiritual moment, a spiritual experience. That is the elevation offering. Wonderful. But you can't stop there. You have to move to the peace offering. What's the peace offering? Make peace between heaven and earth. Bring God into your daily life, into the way you eat breakfast, the way you go to work, whatever else you're doing. And then the deeper recognition is realize that even if you're human, so you're going to fail, there's going to be some disconnect between you and God, but remember that the bond is unconditional and therefore it can always be reestablished because it was always there. In other words, in the conscious mind, the connection could be reestablished because the connection was always there because it's essential and it's unconditional. And that is how, ladies and gentlemen, we are actually progressing in the development of this Parsha, unlike the conventional reading, which starts on a high. Wow, we're coming close to God. We're like Adam, we're bringing an elevation offering, and we end up with a list of sins. That's pretty depressing, right? But now we switched it where we start out with the easy part, which is the yearning to come close to God. We move to the part of making peace between heaven and earth, which is even harder. And then we move to the point where understanding the love to God is unconditional. So that is the progression of the three categories in this Parsha. We have about 3 minutes left. So if anybody wants to ask a question or make a comment or disagree, please do. Otherwise, we'll talk about other things. Trust me, we can fill out the next 3 minutes, not a problem. Go ahead, Warren.
Yeah, I just have a question. Could you clarify what you said, or maybe restate what you said about performing mitzvahs generally and state of mind and intent?
Yeah.
Because I understood what you said.
Okay, so it's a little. There's some confusion here. So there could be some seeming contradictions, but generally speaking, is like this: a person does a mitzvah, the intention is secondary, but the intention is secondary, but the main thing is the action. That's generally speaking. When it comes to the offerings, if I don't have intention, that every detail of the offering is accurate, then it's not a proper offering. So for example, if I'm the priest and you bring me a sin, someone brings me a sin offering, and I have in mind any, it's so much funny how much there's in Talmudic law, there's 6 sections. There's a full 6th of Jewish law, which is devoted to Kadashim offerings. And every scenario is played up there. So when you bring a peace offering, you're supposed to eat the meat for 2 days. If I'm the priest, and I have in mind to eat the meat on the 3rd day, the entire offering is disqualified. I didn't eat it on the 3rd day, I'm going to eat it tomorrow, right? But if any detail of the intention is inaccurate, the offering does not apply, because when it comes to the offerings, the main thing is the intention. Now, that's general rule. Now, if I can anticipate what you're going to ask, can I anticipate what you're going to ask?
Go ahead, anticipate.
I can anticipate. I don't want to be like.
I'll ask you. I mean, I remember you've discussed with us in the past the Tanya. To fulfill a mitzvah obligation, we must actively intend to observe that mitzvah.
Yes. So here, this is where it gets tricky. There has to be a general intent that I'm doing a mitzvah. I put on tefillin, I have to be aware that I'm doing a mitzvah, right? So you have to have that general awareness. But do I have to think about exactly what I'm doing? Do I have to know, the mitzvah has 4 compartments, the tefillin has 4 compartments, and this compartment has a section of the Torah. I don't have to be aware of that. And you know what? And if I think there are 5, I don't disqualify the mitzvah, right? Unlike the offerings, I have to be aware. The awareness has to be full. So you're right. You're right. Every mitzvah, you have to have the general knowledge that this is a mitzvah, but the details of the intention are irrelevant, because it's irrelevant. It's secondary. It's secondary. There is a mitzvah, and there's the awareness of the mitzvah. What we're saying here is, when the offerings, there's no mitzvah without the awareness, because the whole purpose of the mitzvah is to awaken the awareness. There's no reason to slaughter an animal and offer it unless it evokes that feeling within a person that Nachmanides describes, that really I'm becoming close to God, and really I should be offered, but I want to be offered, but I'm not going to be offered because God tells me don't offer yourself, offer something in exchange. I mentioned on Sunday, it's like the binding of Isaac. The binding of Isaac is Adam is prepared to come close to God and escape the world and sacrifice, well, not him, but his son. And God says, I like that feeling, but I don't want that action. The action, you bring the ram instead, right? But if I'm just slaughtering a ram and it's not evoking that feeling within me, it's not a mitzvah. As opposed to tefillin is a mitzvah. The fact that I'm not aware of exactly what the mitzvah is accomplishing is secondary. Now, do I have to be aware that I'm doing a mitzvah? Yeah, I have to be aware that I'm doing a mitzvah. But I don't have to be aware of the details of the mitzvah, because the details of the mitzvah are the cherry on the top. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does.
Okay, thank you. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is a story in short. I hope this was enjoyable. I hope it's the first step to get into the book of
Okay.
third book,
Todah
Rabah, which is the book of how we come close to God and the path in which we come close to God. And I didn't think about it yet, but I wonder if the entire book follows this pattern of the beginning is becoming totally spiritual, the middle would be peace, and the third would be unconditional. Let me think about it. Okay, let's think about it. Let's think if we could apply this model to the entire book. We have another 10 weeks. When we get to the final part of the book, we'll figure out whether the thesis stands or not. I don't know yet. We'll see. We'll figure it out. Okay, wonderful day, everybody.
Bye.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thanks, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi,
Yes.
question. Does the size of the offering reflect the amount, if, say this is a sin offering?
Thank you, Rabbi. Great class.
Thank you, Erica.
I have a bunch of different animals in my barn.
Yeah.
Is the size of my offering, a bull or a cow, does that count greater in the minds of the?
So that's an excellent question. When it comes to the elevation, some offerings, the Torah gives you exactly what you have to bring. A sin offering, the Torah says exactly, either it's a ram or a sheep or a goat, whatever the case is. When it comes to the elevation offering, I want to become close to God. Here I have a choice. I could bring an animal, I could bring a bird, I can bring grain. And it's obviously the grain is the cheapest, the bird is more expensive, and the animal is more expensive.
I remember you mentioned,
One would think that the more expensive one is more valuable. In other words, in the eyes of God. So there's a teaching in the Mishnah. Teaching in the Mishnah says that when all three categories of the offering, which means the animal, the bird, and the grain, the Torah uses the same expression. It's in a pleasing aroma for God. Use a different expression for each of the three categories. No, the Torah uses the same exact phrase for the expensive offering, the intermediate offering, and the cheap offering. Says the Mishnah. What does it teach us? It teaches us, it doesn't matter if you're giving a lot or you're giving a little, as long as your intention is to heaven. Same idea, right?
yes,
Offerings, it's all about heaven. When it comes to all about intention. When it comes to charity, give more. Doesn't matter your intention. When it comes to offerings, intention is everything.
so what would induce someone to give a more valuable?
A feeling of closeness. I want to represent within myself, right? We have part of the problem with we didn't get into it, but Vicky alluded to it, is Cain. Cain is the first person who brings offerings to God. And for whatever reason, God does not turn to Cain's offerings, but does turn to Hevel. And that's elicited the first dispute, which created the first murder in the Torah. So what's happening here is that why does God not turn to Cain? So there are different interpretations. The Midrashic interpretation is because Cain gave the worst. In other words, he gave the worst fruit. And if you're going to come close to God, you want to bring something that will symbolize to you that this is important to you, right? Somebody comes to your house, you give them a beautiful flower, you give them a flower that's falling apart, right? It's not about the flower, it's about the emotion. Yeah, but if you're going to come to your wife on the anniversary, you want to give a nice, beautiful flower, not because the flower is what is the relationship, but it symbolizes something beautiful, as opposed to if I find a flower that's a week and a half old that's totally falling apart. It's not. I mean, the good flower doesn't really capture the relationship, but it symbolizes it. So a person who wants to come close to God and wants to express this idea that this relationship to God is important for me. If it's important, you're going to give luxury. You're going to give the best, and that's what Maimonides says. Maimonides says when you do a mitzvah, make sure you do a mitzvah. Make sure you're doing it in the best way. If you're going to feed the poor, feed them from your best dish. That's what he says. If you're going to make a synagogue, the synagogue should be nicer than your home, right? It's just how we spend our money represents the values that we have, what we value. Having said that, it's not about the money. It's not about the expensive cow. Somebody can bring a bird or a grain and have the same feeling of devotion to God, and God uses the same expression. It's a pleasing aroma to God. It doesn't matter how much you give, because it's about the emotion. But if somebody indeed has the emotion, you can understand that they'll try to do it in the best way.
Understood. Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Wonderful day. Be well.